On a quiet November morning, a woman goes out for a run near her home in Northern California. She doesn't come back. Her husband calls 911. Her phone and earbuds are found on the roadside, cords cut. Within hours, this becomes a nationwide search. 22 days later, she's found on a highway, over 100 miles from home. Branded, bruised, emaciated. She tells the investigators she was abducted by two women, held in a closet, tortured. The country holds its breath in relief. But the real story is far stranger than a kidnapping, because almost everything she said happened didn't. Her name was Sherri Papini. For nearly 6 years, her account remained one of the most talked about mysteries in the country. Doctors documented real injuries, a chemical burn, bruising, weight loss. To law enforcement and millions following online, this looked like undeniable proof of a violent crime. Investigators spent years chasing leads. The FBI got involved. And here's where it gets strange, because almost none of the physical evidence matched her story. Forensic psychologist Paul Ekman has spent decades studying how people behave when lying under high-stakes conditions. His research shows fabricated accounts tend to be vivid on emotional detail, vague on logistics. Papini's account followed that pattern closely. For years, investigators had a story that didn't hold together and a genuinely injured woman. Then, in 2020, the case cracked open, not through a confession, but through DNA forensic genealogy, the same technique used to identify the Golden State Killer, traced DNA on her clothing back to a specific person, not a stranger, a man she'd once dated years earlier. When confronted, he told investigators the truth was nearly the opposite of what the country believed. Papini had reached out voluntarily, asked him to help her disappear, and stayed with him willingly the whole time. The injuries were real. Some appeared to have been self-inflicted or inflicted with his help to make the story believable. In 2022, Papini pleaded guilty to lying to federal investigators and mail fraud for collecting victim compensation tied to a crime that never happened. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. So why would someone do this? Researcher Mark Feldman has studied factitious behavior for much of his career, cases where people fabricate injury or victimhood, not just for financial gain, but for the concern that comes with being seen as a survivor. The goal isn't only money, it's being cared for and believed, often by someone who otherwise felt invisible. That doesn't excuse it. Real resources were diverted, and innocent women loosely matching an early description faced public suspicion. But it explains something that otherwise makes no sense. Why choose weeks of secrecy and eventual exposure over simply walking away? Trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk has written about how people under chronic distress sometimes seek escape through extreme, high-risk methods rather than direct ones, because the extreme version feels less socially costly. Disappearing quietly can look like abandonment. Being kidnapped looks like survival. That doesn't make the choice reasonable. It makes it explicable. Consider the people who almost paid for a crime that didn't happen. An early composite sketch loosely matched thousands of women in the region. For a time, innocent people lived under suspicion for an abduction that never occurred. That's the part of deception research that gets less attention than the lie itself. The collateral damage of being believed too completely, too quickly. You don't have Papini's specific circumstances. Most people never will. But the underlying pull, performing distress rather than expressing it directly, isn't as rare as this case suggests. Feldman's research notes these patterns often emerge in people whose real needs went ignored for a long time before the fabrication began. The lie isn't usually where the story starts. It's where an older, quieter pattern of not being heard finally goes somewhere. None of that erases the harm. The investigators deserved the truth. The women treated with suspicion deserved better. Papini's family deserved honesty, not years of secrecy dressed up as survival. But understanding why a story like this can hold for 6 years says something uncomfortable about belief itself. The most convincing lies are rarely elaborate. They're emotionally specific and factually vague, built to survive sympathy rather than scrutiny. On a quiet November morning, a woman went out for a run and didn't come back. 6 years later, the real story wasn't about who took her. It was about how far a single convincing performance of pain can travel before anyone thinks to check where it leads.